Evaluating Magic cards can be a tricky thing. Even the most experienced players can't always look at a card and figure out whether or not it's going to be good. This is because Magic is an incredibly complex game, and without playing with cards in context, it can be difficult to figure out how powerful the effects they have actually are. One of the most notable examples of this is Tarmogoyf. When it was unveiled in 2007, most people didn't think it was good. They thought that while it was pretty cheap at 2 mana, it would be too hard to grow, and even if you did get the ceiling on it, all it was a big vanilla creature, and it would never be that big in the early game anyway. Ultimately, Tarmogoyf became one of the best creatures of all time, since it turned out making it huge on turn 2 was actually very easy, as there were enough good ways to load the graveyard and get lots of card types into them. And while it's no longer one of the best creatures in the game today, it does still see play in Modern, 18 years after its debut. So it's safe to say that people didn't do a good job of evaluating this card, as you really had to be able to play with it to understand its power. So evaluating how good a card is going to be is really tough, but I think it can also be quite difficult to look at older Magic cards and figure out how good they used to be. This is because if you don't know the metagame and the power level of the cards in their original context, you aren't really going to understand the card. I've done a few videos now looking at 10 cards that used to be really good, even though they aren't very impressive to today's Magic players, and there are tons of other cards in this category. So, in this MTG Top 10, I'm going to look at 10 more cards that look terrible to today's players, but were once so good that they were quite successful in competitive Magic. While most top 10s use rankings, that's not really the case here. These are just 10 cards that look bad today, but used to be great in no particular order. This video is sponsored by Card Kingdom. If you want Magic singles or sealed product, use my link in the description. First, let's look at Chronatog. For 1 generic and a blue, it's a 1/2, and you can skip your next turn to give it +3/+3 until end of turn, and you can only use that ability once per turn. This is the kind of card that probably reads like a joke to today's players, as it is very clearly not worth it 99.9% of the time to time walk yourself for giant growth. An extra turn is one of the most powerful effects in the game. It gives you card advantage, a mana advantage, a tempo advantage, the list goes on. So you should never really want to give your opponent an extra turn, right? And yeah, I mean, that's mostly true. Even back in the day, Chronatog was not a card that you used to actually kill your opponent with, at least not with damage. It took a very particular kind of deck for the Tog to shine, and that was Magic's first true prison deck, Stasis. It's an enchantment that makes players skip their untap steps, and at the beginning of your upkeep you have to sacrifice it unless you pay 1 blue mana. There were lots of ways to lock the opponent out of the game with Stasis, and not all Stasis decks went the Tog route. Many of them used something like Soldevi Digger to keep themselves from milling out, and just waited for the opponent to deck themselves, but Chronatog, once it came out, produced an even more powerful lock. This is because if you had it down and Stasis in play, you could just use its ability at the end of your opponent's turn and give your opponent another turn. While that would normally be bad, as I said before, the fact your opponent is never untapping means that they aren't going to do a whole lot with those extra turns, other than eventually deck themselves. The lock was even more potent if you had Kismet on the battlefield too, as that would mean even new lands would enter tapped, and because of Stasis, they would never untap. So it turns out giving your opponent an endless supply of turns is actually pretty potent, provided you don't actually let them play Magic by using powerful lock pieces and force them to very slowly draw their entire library. Next, let's look at another card that gives the opponent extra turns, Chronosavant. For 5 generic and a white, it's a 5/5, and you can pay 1 generic and a white to return it from your graveyard to the battlefield tapped, and you skip your next turn. Yeah, a 6 mana 5/5 isn't great to begin with, but if you can get it into your graveyard, being able to get it back for only 2 mana would normally sound pretty sweet, but that sweetness turns bitter in a hurry since your opponent gets a time walk out of the deal, which isn't remotely worth it for a vanilla 5/5 that takes setup to get in play in the first place, and it even enters tapped. But like Chronatog, people found a way to use this card. Unlike Chronatog, the Savant was good in spite of giving your opponent that extra turn, and not because of it. It only has 1 top 8, but it came at the biggest stage of them all, the 2006 World Championship. There it was played in a peculiar kind of Tron deck. Most Tron decks look to use the Tron lands to slam big monsters on the battlefield, or lock the opponent out of the game with something like a Mindslaver loop, but Gabriel Nassif's deck at the event went in a very different direction. It was all about using Martyr of Sands to gain absurd amounts of life. You did this by combining it with Proclamation of Rebirth. The proclamation lets you reanimate up to 3 1-mana value creatures at a time when you cast it, but you can also pay 5 generic and a white and reveal it from your hand to reanimate 1-mana value creature. That forecast cost is normally pretty expensive, but the Tron lands make it very feasible for you to play Martyr of Sands, reveal a handful of white cards and sacrifice it and gain like 15 life, then you can reanimate the Martyr and do it again, sometimes multiple times in a single turn. It wasn't an infinite loop, mind you, just something you could do several times, making your life total absurdly high. Having high life on its own isn't enough to win the game though, so the deck turned to Chronosavant. That might seem like a strange choice, but all the deck needs is some sort of inevitable win condition. A creature that just dies and stays dead isn't good for the deck, but a big beater that was almost impossible to remove permanently was perfect. Giving your opponent that extra turn was a downside to be sure, but this deck had such a high life total that it didn't really matter if you gave your opponent those extra turns, because they would never ever be able to kill you once you started looping your Martyrs of Sands. And while it wasn't as common in this deck, sometimes the game would come down to who got decked first, like if they find a way to stonewall your Chronosavants, in which case you could use them to make sure your opponent would run out of cards first. It's not as easy to do here with Chronatog, since it has to be in the graveyard to use the ability, but you can choose to use the ability more than once at a time, and skip several turns, and sometimes that was worth doing. In a format where pretty much every deck was about doing damage to kill the opponent, Proclamation of Rebirth plus Martyr was actually surprisingly similar to a Stasis deck. Your opponent could still technically do stuff, but none of it mattered when you were gaining insurmountable amounts of life every single turn, and that's pretty much the only kind of deck that Chronosavant can work in, but it works super well in it. Next, let's look at another creature where its downsides are seemingly way too large for it to ever be successful in 60-card formats, and that's Phelddagrif. It also happens to be one of my favorite cards, just because the design is so cool, and 11-year-old me especially loved it. Basically, Phelddagrif is the origin of all group hug style decks in Commander, because it's one generic, a white, a blue, and a green for a 4/4 legendary creature that has 3 activated abilities that all give you something, but also give something to your opponent. You can pay 1 white to give the Phelddagrif flying, but your opponent also gains 2 life. You can pay 1 blue to bounce Phelddagrif to your hand, but your opponent draws a card. Or you can spend 1 green to give it trample until end of turn, but if you do, your opponent gets a 1/1 hippo token. So yeah, while this certainly can be fun in Commander because of how political you can make all of these effects, it certainly doesn't read like a card that's playable in 60-card formats, even when we account for creatures being a lot worse in 1996. And indeed, kind of like with Chronosavant and Chronatog, it took a fairly particular deck for this flying hippo to be worth playing, and that was Extended Oath of Druids in 1999, where it put up the second best record at the 1999 World Championship. Oath of Druids is an enchantment with a symmetrical effect. During each player's upkeep, they check to see if their opponent has more creatures than they do, and if their opponent does have more creatures, the player whose turn it is gets to reveal cards from the top of their library until they reveal a creature card and put that card onto the battlefield, and all the other cards that are revealed this way go into the graveyard. Oath is one of the best ways to cheat creatures into play in all of Magic, as if you build your deck correctly, you can put insane things into play on turn 2. But there is a problem. If you're not careful, your opponent can take advantage of it too, because it's symmetrical. Phelddagrif was used in some Oath of Druids builds precisely because of its downside, which gives your opponent creatures. The Griff could keep your opponent from triggering Oath of Druids, while always guaranteeing that you would trigger it. In those days, there weren't completely insane things to cheat into play yet either, so these decks generally had to lean on oathing into Triskelion, and using it to remove anything that it needed to remove, and you could remove the counters to damage the opponent when you weren't in any danger, and you could eventually win that way. With Gaia's Blessing in the deck, you would never run out of cards, and Triskelion would just keep getting shuffled back in, and you'd keep oathing it into play. And Phelddagrif was crucial at making sure you could do this every turn no matter what, because of the hippo tokens it made. And it could also help you do lethal a little more quickly than oathing into a Triskelion every turn alone. Oath of Druids decks are still a thing these days, of course, but nowadays I like to use Forbidden Orchard to give the opponent tokens to make sure you always get to oath, and that's a lot better, since it's a land. But the decks that go that route these days are very much the descendant of the seemingly wacky oath decks that used Phelddagrif. Now let's look at Cognivore. For 6 generic and 2 blue mana, it's a star with flying, and its power and toughness are each equal to the number of instants in all graveyards. That mana cost is definitely eye-popping, and you don't normally want a creature with super variable power and toughness when you're forking over that much mana. I mean, how often are there enough instants in graveyards for this to be remotely efficient? I definitely get that perspective, and I've heard it a lot. This is a card where people often express surprise when I don't include Cognivore on any of my worst cards lists that it's eligible for, because yeah, it looks like a terrible card for all the reasons I just mentioned. However, Cognivore was once a very legitimate win condition in a really good deck, and that's because it was a deck that could simultaneously get around the problem of Cognivore's mana value and ensure that this Lurgoyf was absolutely massive. And that deck was actually the same kind of deck as Phelddagrif saw success in, Oath of Druids. But Cognivore's time as an Oath win condition came several years later in the extended of 2002. Remember, Oath not only cheats the creature into play, it also mills all the cards revealed along the way. So if your deck is filled with a bunch of instants, Cognivore is always going to come into play as a creature that can win the game in a single swing. And a creature like that entering the battlefield on turn 2 is incredible. So incredible that Justin Gary piloted a Cognivore Oath deck to a first place finish at Pro Tour Houston in 2002. While Cognivore Oath never top-8'd another major event, the fact remains that it had a pretty impressive moment in the sun, and one that certainly precludes it from ever being considered one of the worst cards in the history of Magic. Let's look at another creature who doesn't look very good to today's players, Phyrexian War Beast. For 3 generic mana, it's a 3/4, and when it leaves the battlefield, you sacrifice a land and it deals 1 damage to you. That's right, if your opponent removes this, they get a 2-for-1, and even get a little additional value in the form of damage. And if your opponent bounces it, you're still in trouble, because it triggers anytime the War Beast leaves the battlefield. And yeah, that's not a card that would work in today's Magic. I mean, sure, 3 mana 3/4 is just a tiny bit above rate these days, but that's not worth getting 2-for-1 and damaging your mana and your life total. But it was worth it in both Standard and Extended between 1996 and 1999. The first piece of the puzzle with this type of card is simply the fact that creatures were way worse back then. So a 3 mana 3/4 that was this easy to cast was just better in the context of a world where other 3-drops simply weren't big enough to contend with this. But there is definitely more going on here, and that has to do with its typing and its stat line, which played particularly well in Magic formats in the mid to late 1990s. Perhaps most notably, it couldn't be taken down by Lightning Bolt. Other commonly played removal spells that couldn't kill it include Terror and Incinerate. Basically, the War Beast really didn't leave the battlefield all that much because it was hard to kill with spells or in combat, so that downside is definitely mitigated against. That's not to say it was entirely immune to everything, of course. Swords to Plowshares could still do it in, for example, but being able to dodge a bunch of removal and being really efficient was more than enough to make this 3 mana 3/4 artifact worth playing. Furthermore, many decks at the time were running main deck color hate effects that the War Beast could ignore. This included stuff like White Knight and later Paladin and Vec. The War Beast gave black and red aggro decks access to an efficient creature that it could attack through and block these normally pesky creatures. So while the War Beast's downside is way too big today, that wasn't the case back in the 1990s. Now, let's look at Gerrard's Wisdom. For 2 generic and 2 white, it's a sorcery that gains you 2 life for each card in your hand. That's right, this card does nothing but gain you life, and it's clunky as heck as a 4 mana sorcery. Typically, one doesn't want to spend a card to just gain life, nor do they want to spend 4 mana on a way to gain life that is super dependent on you having enough cards in hand. At least, that's certainly true in today's game. But this card's success all came between 1997 and 2001, when Magic was very, very different. Most notably, creatures were significantly worse on average, so if you were playing a control deck in Standard or Extended during those years, this was actually a worthwhile inclusion. As is still true today, control decks often had lots of cards in hand, so it wasn't unusual for this to gain you like 14 life, which was pretty close to insurmountable for many of those decks. I mean, this is an era where you could just remove and counter stuff and mill your opponent out with Millstone as a win condition. A very, very slow win condition. And gaining 14 life went a long way towards helping you survive long enough to activate Millstone enough to win the game. Pure life gain doesn't usually work out in today's Magic, where aggro decks are a threat to be reckoned with. And even if you do spend 4 to gain 14, it's not going to be enough, since that means you did very little to add to the board during your first few turns. So getting to the point where you can cast this is pretty difficult, and even if you do cast it, you're probably still dead on your next turn. But back in the late 1990s and early 2000s, this type of life gain card was still super viable, so much so that it regularly appeared in control decks that put up great results. Next, let's look at another white sorcery that is seemingly inefficient by today's standards, Icatian Town. For 5 generic and a white, it makes 4 1/1 citizen creature tokens. While it's nice to add multiple bodies to the board and all, spending 6 mana at sorcery speed and getting 4 tokens that are just about as small as can be isn't the kind of thing we're usually after. When we spend 6 mana on a token generating sorcery these days, the going rate tends to be 3 2/2 tokens, plus some upside, and that's markedly more powerful than getting 4 1/1s in almost every situation. And I mean, it isn't even like getting 3 2/2s for that cost is anything special outside of limited. However, Icatian Town's seemingly meager token production was once considered really good. One thing to keep in mind is that while tokens seem like a huge part of the game today, Icatian Town was one of the first cards ever to produce multiple tokens with a single effect. So while we may be used to spending similar or less mana to get a lot more out of the tokens that are generated, Icatian Town's effect was actually really novel. I mean, adding 4 bodies to the board with 1 card was practically unheard of, with Hazazin Tamar really the only other card in the game that could do it, and his tokens were a lot more fragile to spot removal, since killing Tamar killed his tokens. So, if you were a deck looking to go wide and confound a deck looking to kill singular big threats with its removal, Icatian Town was the best you could do in the late 1990s. I often say that the term power creep mostly only applies to creatures, as most of the game's best non-creatures came out in the first few years of the game, while basically none of the best creatures did, but power creep also extends to non-creature spells that can make creature tokens too, as Icatian Town can show us. Next, let's look at Slash Panther. For 4 generic and 1 red Phyrexian mana, meaning you can pay for that cost either by paying red mana or 2 life, you get a 4/2 artifact creature with haste. And that's it. This is by far the newest card on this particular list, having been printed in 2011, so we don't always have to go super far back in time to find cards that look underwhelming to us now, but used to be really, really good. I've looked at some other more recent cards in some of the other videos in this series too, and I guess Chronosavant is also relatively new. But yeah, Slash Panther doesn't really look like much, does it? I mean, it's either a 4 mana 4/2 with haste that makes you pay 2 life, or a 5 mana 4/2 with haste. Neither of those options are the kind of thing that makes you say, this is an amazing deal. And indeed, even back in 2011, Slash Panther wasn't good enough to see play in formats like Block, Standard, Modern, or Extended. So it will probably come as a pretty big shock to you that the Panther was once actually really good in Magic's most powerful format of them all, Vintage. That's not something you see every day, a French vanilla creature that isn't good enough in formats with smaller card pools, but is good enough to be sleeved up against opponents who are all packing Black Lotus and the like. But there was a very particular situation in Vintage between 2011 and 2016 that led to Slash Panther actually being an important card in the format. First, it's important to note that Vintage has a very powerful artifact deck called Shops, which uses Mishra's Workshop to produce insane amounts of mana. It's a land that can tap for 3 colorless, provided you spend that mana on an artifact. In general, this is a deck that packs almost exclusively colorless cards and colorless mana, since it also wants to use Ancient Tomb and City of Traders to produce absurd amounts of colorless mana. Throw in the Power 9 Moxen and the like, and that means these decks could play Slash Panther on turn 1. Even in Legacy, a turn 1 4/2 with haste can be a pretty big problem, but that alone wasn't enough to make Slash Panther worth playing. There was also a very particular metagame that led to the Panther being really useful, and that was a metagame absolutely dominated by Jace the Mind Sculptor. He was a pretty new card at the time, and certainly the game's most powerful planeswalker during this era, so much so that pretty much every deck that could play him did. After all, he was also reasonably castable in the very early game with lots of fast mana, and once he was around, he could quickly take over the game with his powerful loyalty abilities. Typically, a Jace player would fire off the 0 ability the turn it came down, as that brainstorm effect in a format as powerful as Vintage was pretty incredible. You just saw so many cards with it and got such a nice advantage. And that's where Slash Panther's seemingly inconsequential self comes in. Because shop decks could cast it so easily with all of their awesome lands and other sources of mana, it could come down out of nowhere and slam into Jace and kill him the turn after he came down. Because shop's decks were largely colorless, they simply didn't have access to any other good haste creatures that could be accelerated out with their lands, and Slash Panther really stepped in to fill that void. Basically, it turns out when you can play something like this on turn 1, and it also happens to basically read destroy one of the most powerful cards in the format, and then stick around and win the game, the card ends up being pretty darn good. So, Slash Panther may not look like much, but the combination of its artifact typing, high power, and haste actually made it a pretty important card in Vintage there for a while. It only got supplanted from this role, which made it good against other Planeswalkers that came later too, in 2016, by another 4 mana card with high power and haste that similarly looks underwhelming. It didn't see that much play in formats of smaller card pools. Fleet Wheel Cruiser, which can come down and smash in for 5 instead, and doesn't make you pay any life to do it. Slash Panther and Fleet Wheel Cruiser might have haste, but I think you should have haste too when it comes to clicking on the subscribe button. I'm trying to reach 100,000 subscribers this year, and I'm getting closer and closer to my goal, and I'd really appreciate your help in getting me there. About half of my viewers aren't subscribed, so even if you think you are subscribed, do me a favor and double check. You won't regret subscribing because I put out at least 4 Magic videos every single week, including MTG Top 10s like this one. Next, let's look at another red card that looks like absolute jank, Dragonstorm. For 8 generic and a red, it's a sorcery that searches up a dragon and puts it onto the battlefield, and it has Storm, which means that for each spell cast before it that turn, a copy gets put on the stack. Everyone knows Storm is really powerful. After all, combo decks built around going off with it have been successful in just about every format at one time or another, and have constantly been successful in the non-rotating formats, and multiple cards have been banned specifically because Storm is so freaking good. But a 9-mana sorcery that grabs dragons isn't usually what people's minds go to when they think of powerful Storm win conditions. Why would it? Brain Freeze and Tendrils of Agony are much cheaper and can win the game in a single turn by milling an entire library or draining all of the opponent's life. Dragonstorm, meanwhile, takes a lot of work to go off and mostly just looks like a fun card for people to play with on the kitchen table. After all, people love dragons. And indeed, when Dragonstorm was originally printed in Scourge, nobody did anything with it, and it was largely considered a terrible card. However, a couple of things would transpire that would lead to Dragonstorm actually seeing very successful competitive play. First off, it got printed on the Time Spiral bonus sheet, and those time-shifted cards were legal in Standard, and Dragonstorm decks would be highly successful at both the 2006 and 2007 World Championship as a result, and even won the whole thing in 2006. This Standard had a perfect storm of cards for this type of deck to actually work. First, the format had red ritual effects, like Rite of Flame and Seething Song, and that made it surprisingly easy to get to 9 mana quickly. Furthermore, chaining those rituals together would raise your storm count in the first place, and unlike other storm counts which generally need a huge storm count to win the game, this deck only needed a storm count of 3 to get there. That's because Bolgarden Hellkite was also in this standard format. This big dragon comes down and does 5 damage divided as you choose among any number of targets. So if you grab all 4 with Dragonstorm, you do 20 to your opponent and they were dead. And just in case you drew a Hellkite, the deck also ran a couple of Hunted Dragons, who could swing for 6 alongside 3 Hellkites, or 12 alongside 2. Decks built around grabbing dragons with Dragonstorm found success in Block and Extended 2 in 2007 and 2008, but believe it or not, that's not the end of Dragonstorm's story. It would go on to find further success in both Modern and Legacy, but for a very different reason. While Dragonstorm's high mana value meant you had to build your deck to find a way to produce absurd mana, and also you had to jam some dragons into it, the decks that used it in both Modern and Legacy played it precisely because of the high mana value. These were Infect decks that looked to win the game very quickly with an early Infect creature plus Blazing Shoal. The Shoal can be cast for no mana if you exile a red card from your hand, and if you go that route, the creature you buff gets +X+0 until end of turn, where X is that card's mana value. This means that if you use it on your 1/1 Infect creature, it's now a 10/1 and will kill your opponent in a single swing because it will give them 10 poison counters. Exiling Dragonstorm was one of the main ways these decks could generate their extremely fast wins, and these decks were so fast that the Shoal actually got banned in Modern. While there are Storm decks in multiple formats today, none of them go this route anymore since it's so dependent on the context of your deck still having the right dragons for you to really go off, and it being so expensive is a huge hurdle too. But once upon a time, Dragonstorm was winning games, either by summoning 4 game-winning dragons to the battlefield, or getting exiled to Blazing Shoal, and that's a pretty impressive track record for a card that was largely ignored the first time it got printed. Let's wrap things up with Thawing Glaciers, a card so good it had to be banned, and then later had to receive a power level erratum, which comes as a total shock to most of today's Magic players, who at best view this as a niche card for some very particular commanders. It's a land that enters tapped, and it can't produce mana either, but you can pay 1 generic mana and tap it to search up a basic land and put it onto the battlefield tapped. Then you return Thawing Glacier to its owner's hand at the beginning of the next cleanup step. Yeah, it's an aptly named card, because it's absolutely glacial. After all, it bounces back to your hand every time you use the ability, and it enters the battlefield tapped, so it can only grab you a land every other turn, and you have to use your land drop each turn to do it. That doesn't seem worth it at all in 60-card formats, does it? But If we take a moment to look at this card independent of thinking about how slow it is actually a pretty legitimate value engine. Every time you use it, it ends up giving you a card of value. And sure, that card is a basic land, but it's still a card, and it fixes your mana and thins your deck out in the process. Both pretty nice things, right? Of course, we can't just eliminate how slow this card is from the equation, otherwise it'd probably still be pretty good today. But we did that exercise for a reason. As like with Gerrard's Wisdom, this is a card that was good in an era where Magic games usually lasted many more turns since creatures were so much worse. Its first success came at the Ice Age block constructed Pro Tour. This is a format with a real paucity of cheap aggressive creatures, so Control X could just go wild with Thawing Glaciers. This was especially true when you combined it with Zurin Orb, an artifact that lets you sacrifice lands to gain life, making Glaciers into even more of a value engine than it already was. Ultimately, both Glaciers and the Orb got banned in Ice Age block constructed because the combination was too good for the format. It made it so really all you could play was a control deck, and the Orb even got banned in Standard too. That alone tells you about how slow the game was at the time. Thawing Glaciers continued to be featured in Standard control decks all the way through 1997, but then it went inactive for a while before getting a second life in the extended format after a rule change made it even better. With the release of 6th edition in 1999, phases and steps, largely as we know them today, were created. Before the rules changed, there was just an end of turn for each player, at which point they would discard down to 7 if they needed to, and any end of turn effects would be put on the stack or in the batch before 6th edition. But the 6th edition rules created a more clearly delineated end phase, which started with end of turn, where abilities were put on the stack and would then resolve, and then concluded with cleanup, during which phase the player would discard down to 7. This breathed new life into Thawing Glaciers. As originally printed, Thawing Glaciers would return to your hand at end of turn, if you had used its activated ability that turn. But now, since there was a step after end of turn, you could wait until that cleanup to activate the Glaciers and grab a land, and then you could activate it again during your turn. So now you could get 2 lands for every time it bounced, turning it into an even more absurd value engine. Ultimately, they changed the wording of Thawing Glaciers so that it now gets bounced at the cleanup step, so these shenanigans were no longer possible. And these days, it more or less works how it did before the 6th edition rules change. So yeah, Thawing Glaciers was really good even before rule change shenanigans, and for a time was downright busted, which is pretty surprising for a card that looks incredibly slow to today's players. So those are 10 bad Magic cards that used to be really good. If you want to own any of these cards to relive their heyday, check out the description where you can find a direct Card Kingdom link for each card that appeared in the video. If you want to make sure you catch future videos, don't forget to subscribe and turn on notifications. If you want to catch up on past videos, including many more that look at cards in this exact category, you should see a playlist on your screen shortly. Thanks for watching.